She sold pepper to make him a lawyer. He sued her for divorce. The courtroom in Enugu was silent except for the sound of a sharp, rehearsed voice echoing off the walls, not Emeka's, but his lawyer's, a polished young man in an expensive suit standing beside him. Your Honor, my client is simply not compatible with his current standing in society, the lawyer said, gesturing toward the woman seated across the room. She sells pepper in the market. My client is a lawyer now. Surely the court understands the difference. Amaka sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, wearing the same faded blue wrapper she'd worn the day she sold her last basket of pepper to pay Emeka's final semester's fees. Amaka, she said quietly, looking past the lawyer, straight at the man who wouldn't meet her eyes. I borrowed money from 3 different women to buy your law books. I sold pepper in the rain so you wouldn't miss a single lecture, and now you sit there and let another man call me not compatible? Emeka said nothing. He let his lawyer speak for him. My client also alleges infidelity, Your Honor, the lawyer continued. Multiple instances. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Amaka's hands tightened in her lap, but her voice, when it came, didn't shake. That is a lie. And you know it's a lie, Amaka. But Emeka wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at a woman seated in the back row. Young, polished, dressed in clothes Amaka's entire pepper business couldn't have afforded in a year. And something in the way he looked at her told Amaka everything she needed to know about why this trial was really happening. What none of them knew, not Emeka, not his new woman, not even the judge reading through the file, was that Amaka had kept something. One piece of proof. One truth Emeka had forgotten existed. And it was about to walk into that courtroom and change everything. If you've ever watched someone try to erase the very person who built them, hit subscribe, because tonight we find out what happens when a man forgets who made him, and the woman he betrayed finally reminds him. 10 years earlier, nobody in Enugu would have believed that Emeka Obi would one day sit in a courtroom and let another man call his wife not compatible. Back then, Emeka was nothing. A bright, hungry law student with more ambition than money, sharing a single room with 2 other boys in a cramped compound off Zik Avenue, surviving on gari and the occasional plate of rice when someone's mother sent food from the village. He had the grades. He had the drive. What he didn't have was the one thing law school actually required: money. Amaka Chukwu had neither of those things either. No degree, no connections, nothing but a small wooden table at Ogbete Market where she sold fresh pepper, tomatoes, and onions from 6 in the morning until the sun went down. But she had something Emeka noticed the very first day he saw her, haggling cheerfully with a stubborn customer over the price of a basket of Scotch bonnet peppers. She had a spine of iron wrapped in a gentle voice. You're going to be a big lawyer one day, she told him, the second time he came to her stall, not to buy anything, just to talk. I can see it in the way you argue with me over 50. I'm not arguing, Emeka said, laughing despite himself. I'm negotiating. Keep telling yourself that. They married 8 months later, in a small ceremony that cost almost nothing, because both of them had almost nothing to spend. What followed were 5 years that Amaka would later describe, without bitterness, as the years I disappeared into pepper. She woke before dawn every single day, sold at the market until evening, and used every kobo of profit beyond their most basic survival to fund Emeka's law degree, his textbooks, his exam fees, his transport to lectures, the small bribes that sometimes made administrative problems quietly disappear. When her own savings ran out in his 3rd year, she borrowed from 3 different women in the market: Mama Ngozi, Iya Chidinma, and a moneylender named Auntie Bisi, who charged interest that kept Amaka awake some nights doing arithmetic in her head. You don't have to do all this, Emeka told her once, watching her count coins by candlelight after a long day at the market, the extra debt weighing visibly on her shoulders. I could get a part-time job, slow the degree down, and lose 4 years you've already fought for? No. Amaka didn't even look up from the coins. You finish, I'll manage the rest. She sold pepper in the rain when the market roof leaked over her stall. She sold pepper the week she had malaria, propped up on a stool because lying down at home meant no money that day. She sold pepper on the day Emeka called to tell her he'd passed his bar exams, and she wept right there at her stall, pepper stains on her fingers, while customers walked past, not understanding why the woman selling them tomatoes was crying with joy. Emeka got his first job at a mid-sized law firm in Enugu, and within 2 years had built enough of a name for himself to open his own small practice. Amaka kept selling pepper. Partly out of habit, partly because some instinct in her, some old market wisdom, told her never to fully depend on another person's fortune, not even her husband's. It was a decision that would matter more than she could have known, because as Emeka's practice grew, as his suits got sharper, his car got newer, his circle of friends shifted from law school classmates to judges and senior partners and their polished, university-educated wives. Something in the way he looked at Amaka began, slowly, to change. "You should let the market go," he told her one evening, glancing at her hands still faintly stained orange from a day of handling pepper. "I can support us now. You don't need to be out there anymore. I like the market, Amaka. It's not about liking it." His voice had a new edge to it lately, one she hadn't heard in their first 8 years together. "I have partners coming for dinner next week, senior people. It doesn't look right, my wife smelling of pepper and tomatoes." Amaka set down the plate she was washing very slowly. "It didn't smell wrong when that pepper was paying your school fees." Emeka didn't answer. He picked up his phone instead and began scrolling through something. A habit Amaka had started noticing more and more, his attention sliding away from her toward a small glowing screen, toward messages she wasn't shown, toward a life quietly building itself just outside her view. She didn't know her name yet. She didn't know her face. But somewhere in Enugu, a woman named Ifeoma, a junior associate at a rival firm, educated abroad, effortlessly polished in exactly the ways Amaka had never had the money or time to be, had already started asking Emeka, over quiet dinners he didn't mention to his wife, why a man of his standing was still married to a woman who sold pepper in the market. And Emeka, who had once negotiated over 50 baskets just to spend a few more minutes near Amaka's stall, had started, without quite admitting it to himself, to agree with her. It started small, the way these things always do. Emeka began coming home later. First it was closing arguments ran long. Then it was dinner with senior partners. Dinners Amaka was never invited to, though wives of other partners were. Then, eventually, he stopped explaining at all, and Amaka stopped asking, because the answers had started to feel worse than the silence. "Ifeoma handled the Adekunle case brilliantly today," he mentioned once at dinner, not looking up from his plate. "She's sharp, Oxford-trained, you'd like her." Amaka said nothing. She'd learned over the past year that the less she reacted, the more Emeka would reveal without meaning to. "She reminds me," he continued, almost to himself, "of the kind of woman I should have been building a life with at this stage." The words landed like a slap, but Amaka simply set down her spoon. "Say the rest of that sentence, Emeka." He looked up, startled, as if he hadn't realized he'd said it out loud. "I didn't mean—" "You did." Amaka's voice was steady, the same steadiness she'd used to haggle over pepper prices for 15 years. "You've meant it for a while now. I've just been waiting for you to say it, where I could hear it." The dinner with the senior partners finally happened 3 weeks later, and Amaka was invited, at the last moment, almost as an afterthought. She wore her best outfit, the good jella she saved for weddings and christenings, and walked into a private dining room full of people whose entire world Emeka now belonged to, and she did not. She smiled, she made polite conversation, she held her own, gracefully, the way she'd always held her own. It wasn't enough. "Emeka tells us you're in trade?" one of the senior partners' wives asked, swirling wine she'd clearly never had to sell pepper to afford. "I sell produce at a Ogbede market," Amaka said simply. "Pepper mostly, tomatoes." A small, polite silence followed, the kind that said more than any insult could have. Later that night, in the car, Emeka was quiet for a long time before he finally spoke. "You could have said you run a small business, it sounds better." "It would have been a lie, Emeka. I sell pepper. I'm not ashamed of it." "Well," he said, staring straight ahead at the road, "maybe you should be. A little, for my sake." Amaka turned to look at him in the darkness of the car, searching for some trace of the boy who used to walk half an hour out of his way just to negotiate over 50 baskets of Scotch bonnet peppers with her. She couldn't find him. I sold that pepper so you could stand in rooms like the one we just left, Amaka," she said quietly. "Don't ask me to be ashamed of the hands that built your career." He didn't answer. He just kept driving. 3 months later, the papers arrived. Amaka was at her market stall, arranging a fresh delivery of tomatoes when a young man in a suit approached her table, not to buy anything, but to hand her a folded document with a court seal on it. "Mrs. Obi, you've been served." She read the first line standing right there at her stall, pepper stains still fresh on her fingers, customers moving around her oblivious. Petition for divorce. Emeka Chukwuemeka Obi versus Amaka Ngozi Obi. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully, placed it in her basket beneath a layer of Scotch bonnet peppers, and finished serving the customer who was still waiting patiently in front of her, because the market didn't stop, even when your whole life just had. "You couldn't tell me yourself?" she asked him that evening, the papers spread on the table between them. 15 years, Emeka, and I found out from a stranger at my market stall. I didn't know how to say it to your face. You managed to say plenty of other things to my face. This, apparently, was too difficult. Emeka rubbed his temples, and for one brief moment, something that might have been guilt flickered across his face. "Amaka, this isn't about hating you. I've grown. I'm not the same man who used to argue with you over pepper prices." "No," Amaka said quietly, gathering the papers, folding them the same careful way she'd folded them at her stall. "You're not. That man knew what he owed people. This one seems to have forgotten." The petition, when her own lawyer finally walked her through it in full, was worse than she'd imagined. Buried in the legal language of irreconcilable differences was a second claim. Infidelity. It read, citing multiple instances, none of which were true, none of which Amaka had ever done, all of which had clearly been written by Emeka's lawyer to strengthen his position and speed the case toward a settlement that would leave Amaka with almost nothing. "He's lying," Amaka told her lawyer, an overworked but principled young woman named Blessing, who'd taken the case for a fraction of her usual fee. "I have never once been unfaithful to that man, not once in 15 years. "I believe you," Blessing said, "but belief isn't evidence. Do you have anything? Anything at all that proves what you actually contributed to this marriage and what he's now trying to erase?" Amaka was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, a memory surfaced. One she hadn't thought about in years. A drawer in the back room of her market stall where she'd kept, out of habit more than intention, every single receipt, every loan agreement, every handwritten IOU from the 5 years she'd funded Emeka's law degree. "I might," she said slowly, "have something." The court date was set for a Thursday in October, and by then, word had already begun to spread through Enugu's legal circles, quietly at first, then less quietly, that Emeka Obi, the fast-rising lawyer everyone had started calling one to watch, was divorcing the wife who'd put him through law school. Nobody said it to his face. But in the hallways of his own firm, in the private WhatsApp groups of his colleagues, the whispers had already started asking the question Emeka himself refused to answer honestly, even to himself. Why now? And why her, when everyone knew exactly whose money had built his career? Ifeoma, for her part, seemed entirely unbothered by the whispers. She'd started appearing at Emeka's side more openly in the weeks leading up to the hearing, collecting him after court sessions, joining him for lunches that used to be private, once even sitting in the gallery of a preliminary hearing, watching Amaka with an expression that was polite on the surface and something colder underneath. "She's already planning the wedding," a court clerk mentioned to Blessing, not unkindly, just as a fact worth passing along, before the divorce is even finalized. Blessing relayed this to Amaka the evening before the final hearing, expecting anger. What she got instead was something quieter. "Let her plan," Amaka said, sorting through a stack of old receipts at her kitchen table by lamplight, the same careful, methodical patience she'd once used to count coins for Emeka's exam fees. "She's planning a wedding to a man who's already shown one wife exactly what he's capable of forgetting. That's not my problem to solve anymore. You're taking this better than I expected." Amaka looked up, and for the first time in weeks, something like calm resolve settled over her face. "I spent 15 years fighting for that man's future, Blessing. I'm not going to spend what's left of mine fighting to keep him. I'm only fighting for the truth. Those are two very different battles. The courtroom was fuller than the previous hearings. Word had traveled, and a small crowd of onlookers, colleagues, and market women who knew Amaka had come to watch. Emeka sat beside his lawyer, sharp in a new suit, Ifeoma seated just behind him in the gallery. Amaka sat beside Blessing, wearing the same faded blue wrapper she'd worn to every hearing, pepper stains long since washed out, but somehow still visible in the way she held her hands. Emeka's lawyer rose first, repeating the claims from the petition with the same polished confidence as before. Irreconcilable differences, infidelity, a marriage that had run its natural course as Emeka's circumstances had evolved beyond what the union could sustain. Your Honor, the lawyer continued, my client has been more than generous in offering a settlement that reflects the realities of... Your Honor, Blessing interrupted, rising to her feet. Before we discuss settlement, I'd like to enter something into evidence. She placed a thick folder on the table. Receipts, loan agreements, handwritten IOUs, a bank passbook showing 5 years of small, consistent withdrawals timed precisely to Emeka's tuition deadlines, exam fees, and textbook costs. 15 years of careful record-keeping kept not out of suspicion, but out of the simple market habit of never throwing away a receipt. This is a complete financial record, Blessing said, documenting my client's contributions to funding the respondent's legal education, money borrowed at real interest from real people, some of whom are prepared to testify. I'd also like to note for the record that the infidelity allegations in the petition are entirely unsubstantiated. No dates, no witnesses, no evidence of any kind, because, Your Honor, they never happened. A murmur moved through the gallery. Amaka shifted in his seat, glancing sideways at his lawyer, who suddenly seemed less certain of his footing than he had a moment ago. Your Honor, Blessing continued, my client is not here to fight for a marriage her husband has already emotionally abandoned. She's here because she refuses to let him rewrite 15 years of her sacrifice as though it never happened. And because a man cannot lie about his wife's character in a court of law simply because it's convenient for his next chapter. The judge studied the folder for a long moment, then looked up, first at Emeka's lawyer, then directly at Emeka himself. Mr. Obi, the judge said, did you or did you not instruct your counsel to include allegations of infidelity in this petition? The room went silent. Emeka opened his mouth, closed it, looked for just a moment toward the gallery, toward Ifeoma, who was watching him now with an expression that had shifted, subtly but unmistakably, from support into something far more uncertain. Your Honor, Emeka said slowly, I may have been mistaken about certain details. Mistaken, the judge repeated flatly. You alleged multiple instances of infidelity against your wife in a legal document, and you were mistaken. Amaka sat very still, watching the man she'd once negotiated over 50 baskets of pepper with, watching him fold slowly and publicly under the weight of his own lie. Not because she'd shouted, not because she'd fought fire with fire, but because she'd simply told the truth and let it stand on its own. Behind Emeka, Ifeoma had gone very quiet, very still. She had not signed up for a man who lied under oath. The judge closed the folder, set it aside, and looked at both parties with the weary patience of someone who had seen this exact story before, in 100 different faces. We will recess, the judge said, and reconvene this afternoon. Mr. Obi, I'd strongly suggest you use the time to reconsider how you'd like to proceed with this petition, and with your counsel's conduct. As the courtroom began to empty, Emeka sat frozen at his table, his sharp new suit suddenly looking, to everyone watching, like a costume he no longer quite fit into. And behind him, quietly, without a word to anyone, Ifeoma gathered her bag and walked out. The recess lasted 3 hours, though for Emeka, sitting alone in a small conference room down the hall from the courtroom, it felt considerably longer. He tried calling Ifeoma twice. Both calls went straight to voicemail. On the third try, a text arrived instead. Short, final, the kind of message that closes a door rather than leaving it open a crack. I didn't leave my job at Adinka & Co. for a man who lies under oath. Don't call again. Emeka read it 3 times, set his phone face down on the table, and sat alone with the silence of a man realizing, all at once, exactly how much he'd been willing to burn down for a version of himself that had turned out to be built on nothing. When the court reconvened that afternoon, the energy in the room had shifted entirely. The gallery, thinner now that the initial drama had passed, watched with the particular attentiveness of people who sensed an ending approaching. Emeka's lawyer rose first, his earlier polish considerably dented. "Your Honor, my client would like to withdraw the allegations of infidelity from the petition and formally apologize to the court for their inclusion." "And the divorce petition itself?" the judge asked. Emeka's lawyer glanced at his client. Emeka, for the first time in the entire proceeding, rose to speak for himself. "Your Honor, may I address my wife directly?" The judge, after a pause, nodded. Briefly. Emeka turned to face Amaka for the first time since the recess. Not the confident, sharp-suited man who'd walked in that morning, but something smaller, stripped of the certainty he'd been wearing like armor for the past year. "Amaka," he said, and his voice, for once, had none of the practiced ease of a courtroom argument. "I built an entire life on convincing myself I'd earned it alone. I let a lie about you sit in a legal document because it was easier than admitting the truth, that I was ashamed of the very thing that made everything I have possible. I was ashamed of pepper stains on your hands, when those hands are the only reason I'm standing in this courtroom in a suit at all." Amaka said nothing. She simply watched him, the same steady patience she'd used for 15 years of market bargaining, of exam fees, of nights doing arithmetic on debt by candlelight. "I'm not asking the court for anything," Emeka continued. "I'm asking my wife, Amaka, I withdraw the petition. Not because my lawyer told me to, because I finally remembered who I actually am, underneath all of this. And I'm sorry. I know sorry doesn't undo a year of humiliating you. I don't expect it to." The courtroom was silent, waiting on Amaka the way it had waited on Emeka just minutes before. She rose slowly, smoothing the same faded blue wrapper she'd worn to every single hearing, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the room. "I sold pepper in the rain for you, Emeka. I sold it sick, I sold it tired, I sold it the day I found out I was 3 months pregnant with a child we lost before you even finished your degree, because I never told you that day, because I didn't want to slow you down." A small gasp moved through the gallery. Even Blessing, beside her, hadn't known that detail. "I gave you 15 years without once asking whether it was worth it. So don't stand there and thank me like I'm someone you're discovering for the first time. I was always here. You're the one who left." "I know. You let a man call me not compatible in a room full of strangers. You let your lawyer put my name next to a lie in a legal document that could have followed me for the rest of my life." "I know, Amaka. I know exactly what I did." Amaka studied him for a long moment, not with the cold satisfaction of watching a man finally pay, but with something more complicated, more human. The exhausted, cautious hope of a woman who had loved someone for 15 years and hadn't quite finished unloving him, even now. "I don't forgive people because they finally got caught, Emeka," she said quietly. "I forgive them when I believe they've actually changed. I don't know yet if that's you." "Then let me show you," Emeka said. "Not today, not in this courtroom. Give me the time to actually earn it back the way you earned everything you ever gave me." The judge, watching this unfold with the same weary patience from earlier, finally spoke. "Given the withdrawal of the petition and the circumstances entered into evidence today, this court considers the matter closed, pending any further filing from either party." There would be no divorce that day. But there would also be no immediate reconciliation, no tidy courtroom embrace, no easy ending handed to either of them for free. Amaka gathered her folder, thanked Blessing quietly, and walked out of the courtroom alone, leaving Emeka standing exactly where she'd left him, with the truth, finally, and nothing else to hide behind it. Emeka did not call the next day, or the day after that. Instead, 3 mornings after the hearing, Amaka arrived at her market stall to find someone had already been there. A small stack of fresh firewood delivered to the woman 2 stalls down who'd once lent her money for Emeka's exam fees, an anonymous debt quietly settled. The next week, Mama Ngozi mentioned, almost in passing, that someone had cleared the old loan she'd given Amaka years ago, principal and interest, with a note that simply read, Thank you for believing in something I almost destroyed. Amaka said nothing about it, but she noticed. Emeka didn't return to the market himself for nearly 2 months. When he finally did, it wasn't with flowers or a speech or any of the grand gestures a lesser man might have reached for. He simply appeared one Tuesday afternoon in an ordinary shirt instead of a suit, and stood quietly at the edge of Amaka's stall while she finished serving a customer, the way he used to, all those years ago, before either of them had anything at all. "I'm not here to negotiate," he said, when she finally looked up. "I know I don't get to do that anymore. I just wanted you to see that I still know the way here." Amaka studied him for a long moment. No gold jewelry, no expensive shoes, nothing performing for an audience. Just a man standing where he'd once fallen in love with her, empty-handed and honest. "You look ridiculous standing there in daylight without a briefcase," she said finally. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't nothing either. And for the first time in over a year, something that resembled the ghost of their old ease passed quietly between them. It took the better part of a year before Amaka let him fully back in. Not because she was punishing him, but because trust, she'd learned, wasn't a door that reopened the moment someone knocked on it sincerely enough. It was rebuilt the same slow way she'd built everything else in her life, one honest transaction at a time. Emeka showed up, consistently, quietly. He sat with her at the market some evenings, no longer ashamed of pepper stains, occasionally even haggling with customers himself, badly, the way he had the very first week they'd met, making her laugh despite herself. He never once mentioned Ifeoma, and neither did Amaka. Some doors, once closed, didn't need reopening for a story to make sense. They remarried the following spring, in a small ceremony almost identical to their first. No grand hall in Lekki, no gold aso-ebi, just family, a few market women who'd once lent Amaka money out of pure faith in her honesty, and a groom who, this time, understood exactly what he was standing next to. "Promise me one thing," Amaka said to him, the night before the wedding, sorting through the same old drawer of receipts out of habit more than need now. "Anything. Promise me that if you ever forget again, if the suits and the courtrooms and the senior partners ever make you forget who built the ground you're standing on, you'll come back to this market and remember, not because I'll always be here to remind you, but because you owe it to yourself to never lose that memory twice." "I promise," Emeka said. And this time, when he said it, there was no performance in it at all. Amaka never did give up her stall. Even years later, with Emeka's practice thriving and their household comfortable in ways the young couple sharing Gary in a cramped compound could never have imagined, she still woke before dawn, still haggled cheerfully over baskets of Scotch bonnet peppers, still kept a drawer full of receipts out of old habit. Not because she needed the money, but because that stall had taught her something no courtroom ever could. That the people who help you build your life are never a debt you outgrow. They are the foundation you keep standing on, whether or not you remember to say thank you. Emeka learned, the hard way, that success built on someone else's sacrifice belongs to both people, and that trying to erase your own foundation doesn't make you taller. It only means you're standing on nothing at all. And Amaka learned that honesty, patient and unshaken, will always outlast a lie. Even one dressed up in a lawyer's expensive suit and read aloud in a courtroom full of strangers. Somewhere in Enugu, a young market woman still tells this story to the girls who help her sort pepper in the early morning light. Never be ashamed of the hands that built someone, she tells them. One day, the truth always finds its way back to the market. If this story moved you, if you believe loyalty and honesty still deserve to win, hit subscribe. Drop a comment telling us what you'd have done in Amaka's position, and share this with someone who needs the reminder tonight. What you build with your own two hands, no one can ever truly take from you.